She's carrying a carpet on her shoulder. Of course, she didn't know what was in the carpet, but now I suppose it could have simply been a body. Hi, welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. Today, a story from Tarnov. So, for some time now, there has been a convent of the Sisters Servants of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Immaculate Conception, and this convent is located on Nowy Świat Street in Tarnow. And the sisters from this convent had been feeling for some time that some kind of stench was coming from the direction of the monastery wall. It just smelled absolutely horrible, but they also concluded that maybe the stench was coming from some animal. Indeed, in the past they had found some small animals there, but it seemed that such a stench couldn't have come from a small animal. But the sisters basically shrugged it all off, deciding there was no problem. Well, now a few years later, it turned out there was a problem after all. I invite you to watch the next episode. This problem basically appeared on June 4th, 1999. Oh well, the wall was already old, the wall started to crumble, it just began to fall apart. The nuns came to the conclusion that it was rather a poor showcase for their property, so they decided to repair the wall. After some time, they organized a renovation crew. The workers entered the site and started working on the wall. So some earthworks began. Basically, they were supposed to dig a trench along the wall to simply reinforce the foundations. When they started digging, it suddenly turned out that some human remains were sticking out of the ground. Well, they looked at each other. It was some kind of skull, some bones, a skull without a jaw. There was no other way. They went to Sister Bojena. Sister Bojena came, looked at all of it, and concluded that there was no other way. They had to notify the police. Of course, there was no doubt that these were human remains, but whether it was a woman, a man, or maybe a child, and most importantly, how this person died or whether they were killed, no one could say. Of course, all these bones and the skull were sent to the Department of Forensic Medicine, and the police started to wonder what to do about it. They began questioning the sisters here. Among others, Sister Joanna said that indeed, a few years ago, there were sounds coming from that area, roughly where those bones were found. Some kind of stench, which I told you about earlier, but the sisters didn't know anything more also. The assumption was that because Tarnov was very experienced, during World War II people simply died. Many of these people were never found, so it was assumed that maybe this was a crime from either World War II or the Stalinist era. It could have been different during the autopsy, the doctor performing the autopsy or examining those bones. However, he came to the conclusion that these were not bones that had been buried for many years or decades, but rather bones that had been buried or found in the ground only recently. Yes, as he calculated, maybe for about 4 to 5 years. Well, if that's the case, we can assume that this person didn't die of natural causes, because how did they end up there? Suddenly by the monastery wall? We had to assume that this person was simply killed. That's when the first details about who this person might have been started to emerge. Here the doctors determined that this was the skull of a woman approximately between 30 and 40 years old. But they were unable to determine how this woman died, whether it was a natural death or if she was killed. Well, you have to give the police credit. They really tried to solve this case. There was one distinctive thing about the body that was found. She had a kind of loop here, like on her collarbone. It was a metal loop which suggested that this woman had once had a broken collarbone, and simply that loop was used to help the bones heal together. Therefore, it must have been some kind of procedure, it must have been some kind of surgery, and perhaps the documentation regarding this procedure is somewhere in the Tarnow hospital. They started searching specifically within the last 4 or 5 years, looking for a woman aged 30, 40 who had undergone such a procedure during which this type of loop was placed on a broken right collarbone. Well, the police searched, they really put in a lot of work, but unfortunately they weren't able to find such documentation. And here it was just some kind of coincidence. Someone simply said that maybe because back in those years such procedures were performed at the hospital in Dąbrowa Tarnowska. So the police officers went to Dąbrowa Tarnowska and once again started searching, verifying the documentation related to this type of procedures and operations. And as it later turned out, that was really a bullseye. They found 31-year-old Marta, who was considered missing. And as it turned out in that documentation, the police read that Marta had undergone a procedure because she had been hit by a truck. Well, that was an important lead. They actually started verifying information and reports about a missing person, and indeed they came across such a report. It looked like Marta left home on October 2nd of that year, so almost 4 years earlier. She left home, went to the store. She was supposed to do some shopping and just come right back, but she never returned. Martha had two children, a son and a daughter, who were under the care of Martha's partner, Adam. Adam himself, when asked if he knew anything about Martha's disappearance, his partner said that he had no idea that it was true. She left and was supposed to come back. She never made any contact and he simply doesn't know what happened to her. DNA tests were done, and the tests confirmed that these are indeed fragments of their mother Martha's body. Also, it was 1999. Remember that basically DNA tests weren't really done back then, it was just the beginning. As you remember, I said that probably the first DNA tests were done during the so called skin case, meaning Katarzyna, whose body fragments were found. But that's a completely different case, probably one of the most high profile in Polish history. But back then, those tests were done for the first time. There was no doubt that it was her, that 31-year-old woman who went missing at the time. The proceedings were initiated, but they were started in February 2001 and discontinued right away in March 2001. So it looks like the entire investigation concerning Marta lasted only a month. Also, it seems that neither the police nor the prosecutor's office had any idea what to do with this case because that's how it was. First of all, it wasn't clear how Marta died. Based on those bones, those fragments, it wasn't possible to determine what she died of or whether she might have been killed. But here, it was hard to assume that there really had been a murder. Therefore, since they didn't have any leads, both the police and the prosecutor's office simply closed the case due to no crime being committed. I would say that the justification you read in the case files, the one you find there, is quite, I would say, bizarre because Tarnow was a provincial city at the time and people simply didn't just go out and disappear. And here in the justification we can read that Marta simply walked, tripped, fell into a pit that was next to the wall, and that's how she died. Well, it's bizarre, I would say. If not for the tragedy of this story, it's almost a ridiculous justification because we know that Martha didn't bury herself. So, from that point of view, I would say it was rather a bizarre justification. As for the fact that it really wasn't known what happened to Martha, that's another matter. At that time, the case was still unresolved. Remained unsolved, it was not detected. And we probably would never have found out what happened to Marta if it weren't for the fact that right here in Krakow we came up with the idea to create ArchiveX. What it is and what ArchiveX does, you of course already know very well. This also coincided with the fact that in 1999 we had a new administrative division of the country, that some provinces disappeared, including the Tarnov and Novi Sonj provinces. But it so happened that the files of such cases, discontinued, unresolved cases, ended up at the provincial police headquarters in Krakow because this was simply where the province was, and these cases as well. Police officers from the cold case unit at the provincial police headquarters in Krakow had access to these cases. And at some point, of course, this all took time because it wasn't until 2002 that the files of Marta's case ended up in the hands of the police officers. They started to verify these materials and came to the conclusion that indeed here, the police officers from Tarnow went to a lot of trouble to find out who the person who died was, that it was Marta. There was no doubt that they put a lot of work into searching for the documentation. But on the other hand, they didn't really look into Marta's life, what she did every day, who she lived with, what kind of company she kept. And that's exactly what was missing in all of this, in these case files, which is, I would say, basic police work. It simply should have been done. That also seems important to me from the perspective of this case. Well, what was important was that, in a way, time was on the side of the officers from Archivomex at that moment. Why? Well, it turned out that Marta had this partner, Adam, but at the time when the police started to take an interest in her life, Adam, her partner, was serving a sentence. He had been arrested and convicted for robbery, so in a way, he wasn't here, he wasn't around. As if, in the minds of the people who surrounded Marta, this probably made it possible to reach people who knew Marta and who could tell something about her. And that's how a whole series of different kinds of testimonies began, including those from her friends and close companions. This friend said that Marta used to be a normal, nice girl who had dreams, worked well, had 2 children, and then she met Adam. Well, and supposedly she got involved with Adam because she didn't want to be alone. She just wanted someone to help her in life, and Adam had a bad influence on her. Adam, a very aggressive man, strongly built, an aggressive, unpleasant person prone to aggression. But he also loved alcohol a lot. And after some time, he got Marta into drinking too, and they would often drink together. That friend also mentioned that Marta had that procedure, the surgery where they put in a band. It's not like she was hit by a truck, as it was written in the documentation back then. But that's because Adam beat her so badly that he broke her collarbone and she was afraid of him. So she told the hospital she was hit by a car. And those were the first statements that shed a completely different light on this case. In those statements from the neighbor. Then it was time for the testimonies given by Marta's children. And here it turned out that the son said that, well, his stepfather is simply a kind of sexual deviant. That he beat him, that he abused him, that he sexually exploited him when he was still a child. The daughter testified similarly. The daughter said that she was supposed to be a caretaker for them, But for them, he was simply an abuser, that he sexually exploited her when she was only 11 years old, that he was such a monster. He demanded sex from Marta when he was drunk, that often when she refused to have sex with him, he beat her and even once naked simply threw her off the balcony. He did the same thing to that boy. Well, it seemed that he was just a domestic abuser, that when the case was being handled, no one had talked about it before. Maybe because people were simply afraid of him. But also in the notes, when the police officers found those notes, it turned out that there were actually quite a few different interventions that the police would come, and most often it was the police who were called. Neighbors who heard those screams, Marta and the children's cries for help, who saw Marta running naked somewhere around the neighborhood, so the neighbors saw all of this and they also intervened. What's surprising from this point of view is why Adam wasn't the focus of attention at that time. Maybe he was, and maybe they just didn't find enough evidence against him. There was no doubt that he abused his family, but of course, just because he was abusive didn't mean he killed Marta. Marta's daughter also said that because of what was happening at home, she was placed in a children's home, that she was in a children's home, and that this happened sometime at the beginning of October 1995, which was when her mother disappeared. Adam came to see the child and told the caregiver that the girl's mother is very ill, that she needs care, and that she simply has to take care of her. And the caregiver or the whole orphanage accepted it without question because he actually took the girl from the orphanage and brought her home, as it turned out. Of course, Marta wasn't there. Adam lied. He brought the girl home so that knowing Marta wouldn't come back, she could somehow replace her mother. Also, in light of all this, the question is, why did the orphanage let the girl go? Why didn't they check all of this? That's also something that shouldn't have happened, on top of everything else. Well, I think those people all started talking because they weren't afraid back then, Adam. There was testimony from Marta's mother who said that at that time, at the beginning of October, her daughter came to give her some money because she owed her. Adam told her then that her daughter had been gone for 3 days, and in general he suggested that she had probably run away, that she had a lover, that she simply ran away with him, and maybe she would come back, maybe not, but there was nothing to worry about because she was just somewhere with her lover. In this investigation conducted by colleagues from the Cold Case Unit, more testimonies are emerging. They give a general picture. These are the statements of a neighbor. This neighbor said that at the beginning of October 95 of that year, she was standing on the balcony and saw Adam walking toward the monastery. He was walking toward that very monastery and carrying a carpet on his shoulder. Of course, she didn't know what was in the carpet, but now I suppose it could have simply been Marta's body. And probably all of this wouldn't be enough if it weren't for such statements, I would say, final ones. That was kind of the final touch from my colleague Adam Jacek. Well, Jacek said that it was in October, at the beginning of October. He saw together with Adam in some place. They had a few drinks, and Adam told him that he probably killed Marta, that they started arguing somewhere on the street, and at her apartment he hit her again, and it looks like she's dead. He even asked that Jacek to go with him to the apartment and check if she was really dead. But that friend didn't want to get involved. He didn't go with him to the apartment. But from all of this, it seemed that Marta was really dead. Based on all of this, because it was, of course, a circumstantial case, the matter went to court and all the witnesses testified one by one. And from this, an image was formed of this Adam who abused Martha, abused her children. He was simply a domestic beast. Adam was convicted. In light of all this. He got 15 years, maybe not much, but he was held responsible for Martha's murder. Sure, if it hadn't been for pure chance, like the workers stumbling upon the body, and then the officers from the Krakow cold case unit taking on the case, we probably would have never found out what happened to Martha and Marta. And maybe thousands of other people would have been considered missing. Adam ended up with 6 charges in total because those were charges related to Marta's murder and multiple rapes of her children. He also told all kinds of things about her. He talked about this Kochasiu. He told friends that she took her documents and ran away. Later, as it turned out, the police found Marta's identification card in the apartment. Because above all, it's a small thing, but he kept Marta's identification card for himself. He did it to fraudulently claim social assistance benefits because he simply needed the identification card, so it was a small thing. But it also shows what kind of person he was, knowing that she was dead, and yet he was still fraudulently claiming benefits in her name. And this is one of those cases handled by the X-Files. On the surface, it seems mundane, trivial, ordinary, but I think from a social point of view, it's also important, and that's it. In today's episode, of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care.